Welcome, dear listeners, to another peaceful journey through history. I'm Thomas, and I'll be your guide tonight as we drift together through one of the most extraordinary tales our world has ever known. Tonight, we're travelling back nearly 800 years to witness the rise and fall of the largest contiguous empire in human history, the Mongol Empire. From the wind-swept steppes of Mongolia to the bustling markets of Baghdad, from the frozen forests of Russia to the tropical shores of Java, we'll follow the remarkable story of how a collection of nomadic tribes became masters of nearly a quarter of the Earth's land. This is a tale of transformation, of a young orphan named Temujin who would become Genghis Khan, of warriors who moved like the wind across continents, of merchants who travelled safely along the Silk Road under the protection of the Mongol peace. It's a story of conquest and culture, of destruction and creation, of how a people who had no written language would reshape the very fabric of civilization. So settle in comfortably, let your breathing slow, and prepare to be transported across time and space. Whether you drift off to sleep or stay awake to hear every word, you're exactly where you need to be. The steppes are calling, and the greatest adventure in human history is about to begin. Let us begin our journey.
In the year 1162, beneath the endless dome of the Mongolian sky, a child was born who would change the world forever. The steppes stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling grasslands that seemed to merge with the heavens themselves, where the only boundaries were the horizon and the imagination. This was a land where the wind carried stories, where horses were companions more trusted than most men, and where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to read the subtle signs of an ever-changing landscape. The child was born clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, an omen, the shamans would later say, that he was destined to hold the world in his hands. His father, Yesuge, was a chieftain of the Kiad clan, part of the great Mongol confederation that wandered these vast grasslands. The boy was named Temujin, after a Tatar chief his father had recently captured, and from his very first breath, he would know both the harsh beauty of the steppes and the constant threat of violence that shaped every aspect of nomadic life. Let us drift back to that ancient world, where the rhythm of life was dictated not by clocks or calendars, but by the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the movement of the stars across the vast night sky. The Mongol tribes lived in felt-covered gers, circular tents that could be assembled and disassembled in minutes, homes that moved with the people as they followed their herds across the endless grasslands. These were people who could read the weather and the behavior of their horses, who could navigate by the stars, and who measured wealth not in gold or silver, but in the strength of their herds and the loyalty of their warriors. Young Temujin grew up in this world of constant motion and endless sky. His childhood was spent learning the essential skills of steppe life, how to ride almost before he could walk, how to shoot a bow with deadly accuracy from horseback, how to read the signs of weather and season that could mean the difference between life and death. But perhaps most importantly, he learned the complex web of alliances and rivalries that bound the Mongol clans together and tore them apart with equal measure. The steppes were not a peaceful place. While the grasslands might appear serene and empty to an outsider, they were actually a complex tapestry of competing tribes, each jealously guarding their territory and their honor. The Mongols were just one confederation among many. There were also the Merkits, the Naimans, the Keratis, and the Tatars, each with their own traditions, their own grievances, and their own dreams of dominance. Raids were common, alliances shifted like the wind, and a tribe's fortune could change overnight. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father Yesuge arranged a marriage for him with Berte, a girl from the Olkunut tribe. This was not unusual. Marriages among the Mongol nobility were political alliances, as much as romantic unions, ways of binding clans together and ensuring mutual support in times of trouble. Temujin was left with Berte's family to serve his future father-in-law, as was the custom, while Yesuge returned to his own people. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. On his journey home, Yesuge stopped to share a meal with some Tatars, the very people who had been enemies of his clan for generations. The Tatars recognized him and saw their chance for revenge. They poisoned his food, and Yesuge died in agony, calling for his son as his life ebbed away on the unforgiving steppes. The news of Yesugei's death reached Temujin like a thunderbolt. At 9 years old, he was suddenly the nominal head of his clan, but he was far from his people, and still just a child. When he finally returned home, he found that leadership of the Kiad clan had been assumed by others, and his family was being cast out. The other clans saw no reason to follow a boy, and without strong leadership, Temujin's immediate family, his mother Hoelun, his brothers, and his sister, were left to fend for themselves on the harsh steppes. This abandonment could have been the end of Temujin's story before it truly began. Cast out with nothing but a few animals, and the clothes on their backs, the family faced the prospect of slow starvation. But Hoelun was a remarkable woman, strong, resourceful, and determined that her children would survive. She taught them to dig for roots and wild onions, to fish in the streams, to trap small game. She kept the family together through sheer force of will, and she instilled in young Temujin lessons that would serve him throughout his life. Lessons about loyalty, about the importance of keeping one's word, and about the bitter consequences of betrayal. The years of hardship that followed were formative ones for Temujin. He learned what it meant to be truly hungry, to go days without adequate food, to watch his younger brothers grow thin and weak. He learned to hate waste and to value loyalty above all else. He also learned that the world was a harsh place where strength was the only currency that mattered, and where survival often depended on one's ability to be more ruthless than one's enemies. During these difficult years, Temujin began to display the qualities that would later make him a great leader. When food was scarce, he would go without so that his younger brothers could eat. When other boys his age were playing games, he was hunting and planning, always thinking ahead to the next meal, the next challenge, the next threat. He was building the mental toughness that would carry him through the trials ahead. But the steppes were unforgiving, and even the strongest will could not guarantee survival. When Temujin was about 14, he was captured by the Teichu clan, who had been allies of his father, but now saw the boy as a potential threat. They locked him in a wooden collar called a kangi, a heavy wooden frame that made it impossible to lie down or rest comfortably. It was a form of portable prison, designed to humiliate and weaken captives. For days, Temujin was paraded from camp to camp, a symbol of the fate that awaited those who challenged the established order. The wooden collar chafed his neck raw, and he was given barely enough food and water to survive. But even in captivity, his mind was working, planning, looking for opportunity. He studied his captors, learned their routines, and waited for his chance. That chance came during a feast, when his guards had been drinking, and their attention was focused on the celebrations. Temujin struck one of his guards with his wooden collar, stunning him, and then disappeared into the darkness of the steppe night. He hid in a river, submerged up to his neck with only his face above water, breathing through his nose while search parties passed by overhead. It was a night that would become legend, the night that Temujin proved that no cage could hold him, that no circumstance could break his spirit. His escape from the Teichud was more than just a physical liberation, it was a psychological transformation. Word of his daring escape spread across the steppes, and suddenly people began to take notice of Yesugei's son. Here was a young man, who refused to accept defeat, who could turn desperate circumstances to his advantage, who possessed the kind of audacious courage that inspired others, and struck fear into enemies. Slowly, carefully, Temujin began to build his power base. He started with his immediate family, then reached out to childhood friends and distant relatives. He sought out Jamuka, his blood brother from childhood, and for a time the two young men worked together, their forces combining to create a formidable war band. But even as they cooperated, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. Both were natural leaders, both had ambitions that extended beyond mere survival, and both understood that the steppes were not large enough for two men with dreams of empire. The relationship between Temujin and Jamuka was complex, and would ultimately prove tragic. They had been closer than brothers in childhood, sworn to eternal friendship in the sacred ritual of blood brotherhood. But as they grew older, and their ambitions expanded, their fundamental differences became more apparent. Jamuka represented the old ways, the traditional tribal structure, where power was distributed among many chiefs, where raids and counter-raids were the natural order of things. Temujin, however, was beginning to envision something entirely different, a unified Mongol nation, where all tribes would bow to a single Khan, where the constant internal warfare would end, and where the combined strength of all the Mongol clans could be directed outward against their enemies. The first major test of Temujin's growing power came when the Merkits, seeking revenge for an old slight, raided his camp and captured his wife Berta. The Merkits were one of the most powerful tribes on the steppes, and their attack was devastating. They burned Temujin's camp, scattered his followers, and rode away with Berta as a prize. For many tribal leaders, this might have been the end, the demonstration that they lacked the strength to protect even their own families. But Temujin's response revealed the strategic mind that would eventually conquer half the world. Rather than launching a hopeless direct assault on the Merkits, he carefully assembled a coalition of allies. He appealed to his blood brother Jamukha, reminding him of their sworn friendship and the obligations that bound them together. He reached out to Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karaite tribe, who had been allied with his father Yesuge. Most importantly, he appealed to their sense of honor and justice, arguing that the Merkits' actions were not just an attack on his family, but an assault on the natural order of the steppes. The coalition that Temujin assembled was impressive. Thousands of warriors from multiple tribes, all united behind the goal of rescuing Berta and punishing the Merkits. The campaign that followed was swift and brutal. The combined forces struck the Merkits at dawn, catching them completely off guard. The battle was over before the sun reached its zenith, and Berta was free. But more importantly, Temujin had proven that he could unite traditionally hostile tribes behind a common cause, and that he possessed the strategic vision to turn apparent weakness into overwhelming strength. The successful rescue of Berta marked a turning point in Temujin's rise to power. Word of his achievement spread across the steppes, and warriors began to seek him out, drawn by his reputation for bold action and strategic brilliance. But success also brought new challenges. The old tribal leaders began to see him as a threat, and the delicate balance of power on the steppes began to shift in ways that would ultimately lead to conflict. The break with Jamukha, when it came, was both inevitable and heartbreaking. The two blood brothers had different visions for the future of the Mongol people, and their personal ambitions were increasingly incompatible. Jamukha favored the traditional system, where power was distributed among many chiefs, while Temujin was moving toward a more centralized form of leadership. The final rupture came over a seemingly minor incident, a dispute over the theft of horses, but it represented a fundamental disagreement about how the Mongol tribes should be organized and led. The civil war that followed was brutal and prolonged. Brother fought against brother, families were torn apart, and the steppes ran red with Mongol blood. It was a conflict that would drag on for years, with alliances shifting and reforming, with victories and defeats on both sides, and with the constant threat that the Mongol people would destroy themselves in their quest for dominance. During these years of conflict, Temujin continued to evolve as a leader. He learned to balance mercy with ruthlessness, to reward loyalty while punishing betrayal, to inspire devotion while maintaining discipline. He began to develop the administrative and military innovations that would later make the Mongol Empire so formidable. He organized his forces not according to traditional tribal lines, but according to a decimal system, units of 10, 100,000 and 10,000 warriors. This broke down the old clan loyalties and created a more flexible, efficient military organization. Perhaps most importantly, Temujin began to articulate a vision that extended beyond mere tribal warfare. He spoke of uniting all the Mongol tribes under a single banner, of ending the constant internal conflicts that weakened them, of creating a great nation that could stand against any enemy. This vision was radical for its time. The Mongol tribes had been fighting among themselves for centuries, and the idea of permanent unity seemed almost impossible to achieve. But Temujin's vision was compelling, and it attracted followers who were tired of the endless cycle of raids and counter-raids, of the constant uncertainty and bloodshed that characterized life on the steppes. Warriors from defeated tribes were welcomed into his army, if they proved their loyalty. Skilled craftsmen and administrators were valued regardless of their tribal origin. Slowly, carefully, Temujin was building something new, not just a tribal confederation, but the foundation of a true nation. The years of civil war also tested Temujin's character in ways that would shape his future reign. He experienced both crushing defeats and remarkable victories, learning from each setback and building on each success. He learned to read the complex political landscape of the steppes, to identify potential allies and enemies, to recognize when to fight and when to negotiate. Most importantly, he learned that true strength came not from individual prowess, but from the ability to unite diverse groups of people behind a common cause. One of the most significant aspects of Temujin's rise was his relationship with his followers. Unlike traditional Mongol leaders who ruled through hereditary right or brute force, Temujin earned loyalty through a combination of personal charisma, military success, and a genuine concern for his people's welfare. He shared the hardships of his warriors, eating the same food and sleeping under the same stars. He promoted men based on merit rather than birth, creating opportunities for advancement that had never existed before in Mongol society. This meritocratic approach was revolutionary. In traditional Mongol society, a man's position was largely determined by his clan membership and family connections. Temujin changed this, creating a system where talent and loyalty were rewarded regardless of one's background. Former enemies who proved their worth could rise to positions of great responsibility, while traditional nobles who showed incompetence or disloyalty could find themselves stripped of their positions. As the civil war dragged on, both sides began to feel the strain. The constant fighting was weakening the Mongol people as a whole, making them vulnerable to their external enemies. The Tatars, the Karatis, and other neighboring tribes watched with interest as the Mongols fought among themselves, ready to take advantage of any opportunity to expand their own power at Mongol expense. It was during this period that Temujin began to demonstrate another quality that would serve him well in his future conquests: the ability to learn from his enemies and adapt their successful tactics to his own use. He studied the military organizations of the settled peoples around the steppes, learning about siege warfare, logistics and administration. He welcomed foreign merchants and craftsmen into his territory, eager to learn about the technologies and techniques that could give his forces an advantage. This openness to new ideas was another departure from traditional Mongol practices. Most steppe peoples were conservative by nature, preferring to stick with the tried and true methods that had served their ancestors for generations. Temujin, however, was always looking for ways to improve and innovate, whether in military tactics, administrative practices, or diplomatic strategies. The turning point in the civil war came when Temujin managed to defeat and capture Jamaica in a final, decisive battle. The confrontation between the two blood brothers was both a military engagement and a personal tragedy. When Jamaica was brought before him in chains, Temujin offered him a chance to renew their old friendship and join his cause. But Jamaica, knowing that there could be only one supreme leader among the Mongols, refused the offer and asked for an honorable death. The execution of Jamaica was a somber moment that marked the end of Temujin's youth and the beginning of his transformation into Genghis Khan. The two men had been friends, rivals, and enemies, but they had also been the two most capable leaders of their generation. With Jamaica's death, the last serious obstacle to Mongol unification was removed. But the cost had been enormous. Families had been torn apart, thousands of warriors had died, and the steppes had been bathed in blood. But from this tragedy, something new was born. With the civil war finally over, Temujin was able to focus on the larger goal of uniting all the Mongol tribes under a single banner. He began to reach out to the clans that had not been directly involved in the civil war, using a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and genuine appeals to Mongol unity. His message was simple but powerful: the age of tribal warfare was over, and the time had come for the Mongol people to stand together as one nation. The process of unification was gradual but steady. Some tribes joined voluntarily, attracted by Temujin's vision and his growing reputation. Others were conquered in swift military campaigns, their warriors absorbed into Temujin's growing army. Still others were won over through careful diplomacy, their leaders convinced that their interests would be better served by joining the emerging Mongol Confederation than by resisting it. By the year 1206, Temujin had achieved what many had thought impossible. He had united virtually all the Mongol tribes under his leadership. The scattered clans that had fought among themselves for centuries were now part of a single, powerful confederation. The warrior who had once been an outcast orphan was now the undisputed leader of the Mongol people. The formal ceremony that marked this achievement took place at a great assembly called a Kurultai, where representatives from all the major Mongol clans gathered to acknowledge Temujin's supremacy. It was a momentous occasion, filled with ancient rituals and solemn oaths of loyalty. The shamans spoke of divine favor, the warriors pledged their swords to his service, and the tribal leaders acknowledged his authority over all Mongol lands. But the most significant moment came when Temujin was given a new name, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This was more than just a title, it was a transformation of identity. The orphan boy who had once dug for roots to survive was now the great Khan of all the Mongols, the supreme leader of a united nation that stretched across the vast steppes of Central Asia. The newly proclaimed Genghis Khan understood that unification was only the beginning. The Mongol tribes had been brought together, but they needed to be forged into a true nation. He began to implement the administrative and military reforms that would make the Mongol Empire possible. The decimal system of military organization was expanded and refined. Laws were codified to ensure justice and order. Trade was encouraged and protected. Most importantly, a sense of common identity and purpose was fostered among people who had traditionally seen themselves as members of competing tribes. The transformation of the Mongol Confederation into a unified nation was not just a political achievement. It was a cultural and social revolution. Traditional tribal hierarchies were replaced by a more meritocratic system. The constant raiding and feuding that had characterized steppe life for centuries was channeled into external conquest. The martial skills that had been used in internal warfare were now directed toward expanding Mongol territory and influence. Genghis Khan also began to look beyond the steppes. The unification of the Mongol tribes had created a formidable military force, but it had also created new challenges. The steppes could only support so many people, and the traditional nomadic lifestyle was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the population grew. The solution, as Genghis Khan saw it, was expansion, the conquest of new territories that could provide resources, trade opportunities, and outlets for Mongol ambition. The first targets were the traditional enemies of the Mongols, the Tatars, who had killed his father, and the other nomadic tribes that had long been rivals for control of the steppes. These campaigns were swift and brutal, but they also served as training exercises for the greater conquests that were to come. The Mongol army learned to fight as a unified force, developed new tactics and strategies, and gained the experience that would serve them well in their future battles against the settled civilizations of China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. As we drift toward the end of this first chapter in our story, it's worth reflecting on the magnitude of what had been accomplished. In the space of just a few decades, a scattered collection of nomadic tribes had been transformed into a unified nation under the leadership of one of history's most remarkable figures. The boy who had once been abandoned on the steppes had become the great Khan of all the Mongols, the supreme leader of a people who would soon shape the very foundations of the known world. But this was still just the beginning. The real story of the Mongol Empire, its conquests, its administration, its cultural achievements, and its ultimate legacy, was yet to unfold. Genghis Khan had united the Mongol tribes, but he had also created a force that would reshape the political, economic and cultural landscape of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East for centuries to come. The steppes that had once echoed with the sounds of tribal warfare now resonated with the preparations for world conquest. The scattered clans that had fought among themselves for generations were now united behind a common vision of empire. The age of the Mongol Empire was about to begin, and the world would never be the same. As you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind drift across those vast grasslands where it all began. Feel the wind that carries the scent of adventure. Hear the distant thunder of hoofbeats that would soon echo across continents. In your dreams you might glimpse the young Temujin gazing at the stars and imagining a future beyond the horizons. Or see the moment when he first understood that the world was larger than the steppes, and that it was waiting to be conquered. The greatest adventure in human history has begun, and tomorrow we will follow the Mongol armies as they ride forth to conquer an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe.
But for now, rest peacefully in the knowledge that from the humblest beginnings can come the greatest achievements, and that the human spirit, when united by vision and determination, can accomplish things that seem impossible. Sleep well, and dream of endless horizons.
The year 1207 dawned clear and bright over the unified Mongol nation, and with it came the beginning of one of history's most extraordinary chapters of conquest and transformation. Genghis Khan, the great Khan of all the Mongols, stood at the threshold of empire, his gaze turning from the familiar steppes toward the vast world that lay beyond. The tribal wars were over, the clans were united, and now a new kind of warfare was about to begin, not the seasonal raids and counter-raids of nomadic tradition, but systematic conquest on a scale the world had never seen. Let us drift back to that momentous time, when the morning mist still clung to the grasslands, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted sea. The Mongol army that Genghis Khan had forged was unlike anything that had come before. Gone were the chaotic tribal war bands of the past, replaced by a disciplined, organized force that moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The decimal system of organization, units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, had created a military structure that was both flexible and efficient, capable of rapid movement across vast distances while maintaining tight command and control. The warriors themselves had been transformed as well. These were no longer simple tribal fighters motivated by personal glory or clan loyalty. They were soldiers of the great Khan, united by a common purpose and bound by an iron discipline that would have been impossible to maintain under the old tribal system. They rode with the wind, lived off the land, and moved faster than any army before them. Most importantly, they fought not just for plunder or revenge, but for the vision of a world empire that their Khan had planted in their minds. The first target of Genghis Khan's imperial ambitions was the Western Jat Kingdom, a Tibetan state that controlled the crucial trade routes through the Hexi corridor. The Western Jat had grown rich from the Silk Road trade, their cities filled with merchants and their treasuries heavy with gold. But they had also grown complacent, their armies more accustomed to ceremony than battle, their leaders more concerned with court intrigue than military preparedness. The campaign against the Western Jat began in 1209 and would serve as a testing ground for the Mongol military machine. It was here that Genghis Khan first encountered the challenge of siege warfare, learning to adapt his fast-moving cavalry tactics to the problem of taking fortified cities. The Mongols had no experience with walls and gates, towers and defensive works. They were creatures of the open steppe, where mobility and archery were the keys to victory. But Genghis Khan's genius lay not just in his ability to inspire and lead, but in his willingness to learn and adapt. When his initial assaults on Western Jat cities failed, he did not retreat in frustration. Instead, he began to study the art of siege warfare, learning from Chinese engineers and foreign advisors who joined his cause. He experimented with new tactics, developed new technologies, and gradually transformed his horse-borne warriors into a force capable of taking the strongest fortifications. The siege of Zhongxing, the Western Jat capital, demonstrated the evolution of Mongol tactics. Unable to take the city by direct assault, Genghis Khan ordered his engineers to divert the Yellow River, flooding the surrounding countryside and cutting off the city's water supply. It was a patient, methodical approach that showed the Mongols could be as cunning in siegecraft as they were fierce in open battle. The city eventually surrendered, and with it, the Western Jat Kingdom became the first major conquest of the growing Mongol Empire. The success in Western Jat was more than just a military victory. It was a psychological triumph that sent shockwaves across Asia. The Mongols had proven that they could take cities as well as win battles, that they could adapt their tactics to meet new challenges, and that they possessed the organizational skills necessary for large-scale conquest. Word of their success spread along the trade routes, carried by merchants and travelers who had witnessed the speed and efficiency of the Mongol war machine. With the Western Jat subdued, Genghis Khan turned his attention to a far greater prize, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin, ruled by the Jurchen people, controlled one of the wealthiest and most populous regions in the world. Their capital at Zhonggu, modern-day Beijing, was a city of over 1 million people, protected by massive walls and defended by armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was a challenge that would test every aspect of Mongol military capability. The war against the Jin began in 1211 and would continue for more than 2 decades, outlasting Genghis Khan himself. But the early campaigns revealed the devastating effectiveness of Mongol strategy and tactics. The Mongols did not simply charge at the Jin defenses, they systematically destroyed the Jin capacity to resist, targeting supply lines, communication networks, and agricultural regions. They moved too fast for the Jin armies to catch, struck where they were least expected, and melted away before organized resistance could form. The psychological impact of these campaigns was as important as their military success. The Jin had considered themselves the heirs to Chinese civilization, the masters of the most sophisticated military and administrative system in the world. But they found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight by their rules, that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, that turned their own size and complexity against them. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Jin campaign was how Genghis Khan managed to turn the settled population against their own government. The Jin dynasty was already unpopular among many Chinese, who resented Jurchen rule and heavy taxation. The Mongols, despite their fearsome reputation, often proved to be more tolerant and less oppressive than the Jin administrators. Skilled craftsmen, engineers and administrators who submitted to Mongol rule were often allowed to keep their positions, and were treated with respect. Cities that surrendered without resistance were spared destruction, while those that resisted were made examples of. This policy of calculated mercy mixed with ruthless punishment became a hallmark of Mongol conquest. It was not mere brutality, but a carefully crafted strategy designed to minimize resistance and maximize the speed of conquest. Cities that heard of the fate of those who resisted were more likely to surrender without a fight, while those that submitted early were rewarded with relatively gentle treatment. The siege of Jonggu in 1215 demonstrated the full development of Mongol siege capabilities. The great capital, with its massive walls and enormous population, had seemed impregnable. But the Mongols had learned well from their earlier experiences. They cut off the city's supply lines, prevented relief forces from reaching the defenders, and gradually tightened their grip until the city was starving. When Jonggu finally fell, it marked the effective end of Jin power in northern China, though the dynasty would continue to exist in reduced form for another decade. The fall of Jonggu was a turning point not just in the war against the Jin but in the entire trajectory of Mongol expansion. The wealth captured from the great city funded further conquests, while the administrative records and governmental personnel that fell into Mongol hands provided valuable insights into the management of large settled populations. Genghis Khan began to understand that conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge was governing the vast territories and diverse peoples that were falling under Mongol control. It was during this period that Genghis Khan began to develop the administrative innovations that would make the Mongol Empire possible. He created a system of communication using mounted messengers that could carry orders across vast distances in remarkably short time. He established a uniform legal code that applied to all his subjects, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. Most importantly, he began to delegate authority to capable administrators, both Mongol and non-Mongol, who could manage the day-to-day operations of conquered territories while he focused on further expansion. While the war against the Jin continued, Genghis Khan's attention was drawn westward by events in Central Asia. The Kakhreddin Empire, which stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, had been watching the rise of Mongol power with growing concern. The Kakhreddin Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruled over a vast territory that included much of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. His empire was wealthy, his armies were numerous, and his cities were among the most magnificent in the world. The initial contact between the Mongols and the Kakhreddin Empire was peaceful. Genghis Khan, ever the pragmatist, preferred trade to warfare when possible, and he sent a large merchant caravan to establish commercial relations with the Kakhreddin Shah. The caravan was led by Muslim merchants, and carried goods worth a fortune: silk, furs, jade, and other precious items from the expanding Mongol domains. But tragedy struck when the caravan reached the border city of Otrar. The governor, Inalchuk, suspected the merchants of being spies, and ordered them executed, seizing their goods for himself. When word of this reached Genghis Khan, he was furious, but he still sought a peaceful resolution. He sent ambassadors to the Kakwed Shah, demanding that Amalchuk be handed over for punishment, and that compensation be paid for the murdered merchants. The Kakwed Shah's response was one of the most fateful decisions in medieval history. Instead of apologizing and surrendering the guilty governor, he had the ambassadors killed, and their heads sent back to Genghis Khan. It was an act of such incredible arrogance and stupidity that it defied comprehension. The Kakwed Shah had chosen war with the most dangerous military force in the world, over a simple apology and the punishment of one corrupt official. Genghis Khan's reaction was swift and terrible. He suspended the campaign against the Jin, recalled his armies from China, and began preparing for what would become the most devastating conquest in medieval history. The Mongol war machine, hardened by years of fighting in China, was about to be unleashed on the Islamic world with unprecedented fury. The campaign against the Kakwed Empire began in 1219 and would last for 3 years. It was a masterpiece of strategic planning and tactical execution, demonstrating the full maturity of Mongol military doctrine. Genghis Khan did not simply invade the Kakwed Empire, he systematically destroyed it, city by city, army by army, until nothing remained but ruins and memories. The speed of the Mongol advance was breathtaking. While the Kakwed Shah's armies were concentrated in the south, expecting an attack from that direction, Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns that struck simultaneously across a front hundreds of miles wide. The Mongols crossed the Sirdarya River in winter, something their enemies had thought impossible, and appeared before the great trading cities of Transoxiana, like avenging spirits. The siege of Bukhara, one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning and culture, exemplified the Mongol approach to conquest. The city was surrounded and cut off from all aid, its defenders overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Mongol assault. When the city fell, Genghis Khan himself entered the great mosque and declared that he was the punishment of God, sent to chastise the people for their sins. The city's libraries, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, were burned, and its population was either killed or enslaved. The destruction of Bukhara was followed by the even more devastating conquest of Samarkand, another jewel of Central Asian civilization. The city, which had been a center of trade and culture for over 1,000 years, was reduced to rubble in a matter of days. The Mongols had perfected the art of siege warfare to such a degree that even the strongest fortifications could not long resist their assault. But it was the fate of Urgench, the capital of the Kakwed Empire, that truly demonstrated the terrible price of resistance to Mongol conquest. The city, located on the Amu Darya River, was one of the largest and most prosperous in Central Asia. Its walls were high and thick, its defenders were numerous and determined, and its location seemed to offer natural protection against invasion. The siege of Urgench lasted for months, with the Mongols gradually tightening their grip around the city. They diverted rivers, built massive siege engines, and launched assault after assault against the walls. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender would mean death or slavery. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The Mongol war machine was too powerful, too well organized, and too ruthless to be stopped by mere walls and brave defenders. When Urgench finally fell, the Mongols' revenge was total and terrible. The city was not just conquered but completely destroyed, its population killed or scattered, its buildings torn down stone by stone. The Mongols even diverted the river to flood the ruins, ensuring that the city could never be rebuilt. It was a demonstration of what happened to those who dared to resist the will of the great Khan. The destruction of the Kakwed Empire was more than just a military conquest, it was a cultural catastrophe that changed the course of Islamic history. The great cities of Central Asia, which had been centers of learning and culture for centuries, were reduced to ruins. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture in the region were destroyed, turning fertile lands into deserts. The population, which had numbered in the millions, was decimated by warfare, disease and forced migration. But from the Mongol perspective, the campaign was a complete success. The Kakwed Empire had been eliminated as a threat. Vast territories had been added to the Mongol domains.
and enormous wealth had been captured to fund further conquests. The Mongol army, blooded by years of warfare and enriched by the spoils of conquest, was ready for even greater challenges. The conquest of the Kakrid mid-empire also opened new horizons for Mongol expansion. To the west lay the kingdoms of Europe, divided and quarreling among themselves. To the south lay the rich lands of India, with their vast populations and accumulated wealth. To the east, the conquest of the Jin dynasty remained to be completed, while beyond China lay the islands of Japan and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. During the later stages of the Kakrid mid-campaign, Genghis Khan dispatched two of his most capable generals, Jebe and Subutai, on a reconnaissance mission that would become one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. These two commanders, with a force of only about 30,000 men, were ordered to pursue the fleeing Kakrid Midshah, and then to continue westward to explore the lands beyond the Caspian Sea. The expedition of Jebe and Subutai was a masterpiece of long-distance warfare. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains, defeated the Georgian armies, and burst into the steppes of what is now southern Russia. There they encountered the Cumans, a nomadic people related to the Mongols, and the various Russian principalities that had been expanding eastward for centuries. The Battle of the Kakra River in 1223 was the first encounter between Mongol and European forces, and it demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Mongol tactics against Western military doctrine. The combined Russian and Cuman forces outnumbered the Mongols by more than 2-1, but they were completely outmaneuvered and destroyed. The Mongol victory was so complete that it sent shockwaves throughout Europe, though most Western leaders dismissed it as a fluke or greatly exaggerated the reports. The success of the reconnaissance mission confirmed what Genghis Khan had suspected, that the lands to the west were rich, divided, and vulnerable to conquest. The feudal armies of Europe, while brave and well-equipped, were no match for the speed and coordination of Mongol cavalry. The political fragmentation of the region, with its countless kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, meant that unified resistance would be almost impossible to organize. But Genghis Khan's attention was not yet focused on Europe. He was an old man now, in his 60s, and he understood that his time was limited. The great work of empire building would have to be completed by his successors, but first he needed to ensure that the foundations were solid, and that the succession was secure. The return journey from the Kakrid mid-campaign was marked by careful planning for the future. Genghis Khan divided his empire among his sons, establishing the framework for what would become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Jochi received the westernmost territories, including the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe. Chagatai was given Central Asia, including the conquered territories of the Kakrid mid-empire. Ogaday, who had been designated as the Great Khan's successor, received the traditional Mongol heartland. Tolui, the youngest son, was given the family patrimony in Mongol, along with the responsibility for maintaining the Mongol military traditions. The division of the empire was not just a practical necessity, but a reflection of Genghis Khan's understanding of the challenges facing his successors. The Mongol Empire was already too large to be governed effectively by a single ruler, and it was growing larger with each passing year. By creating separate khanates, each with its own ruler and administrative structure, Genghis Khan was laying the groundwork for a system that could manage the vast territories and diverse populations that would soon be under Mongol control. But the Great Khan was not yet ready to retire. There was still unfinished business in the east, where the Jin dynasty continued to resist from its reduced territory in northern China. More importantly, there was the matter of the Tangut kingdom of Western China, which had been subdued but not destroyed, and which had proven unreliable as a Mongol vassal. The final campaign of Genghis Khan's life was against the Tangut kingdom, beginning in 1226. It was a campaign motivated as much by anger and frustration as by strategic necessity. The Tangut had repeatedly broken their promises of loyalty, had failed to provide troops for the Kakrid mid-campaign, and had shown signs of planning an alliance with the Jin against the Mongols. The war against the Tangut was swift and brutal, demonstrating that age had not diminished the Great Khan's military abilities. The Mongol army swept through the Tangut territory like a whirlwind, taking city after city, and destroying everything in its path. The Tangut king was forced to flee to his mountain strongholds, where he was eventually cornered and forced to surrender. But victory came at a terrible price. During the campaign, Genghis Khan fell ill, possibly from injuries sustained in a riding accident. As his condition worsened, he knew that his time was running out. The great conqueror, who had never known defeat, was facing his final enemy, one that no amount of tactical brilliance or strategic planning could overcome. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new phase in Mongol expansion. The great Khan had laid the foundations for the largest empire in history, but it would be left to his successors to complete the structure. The Mongol war machine that he had created would continue to roll forward, conquering new territories and subjugating new peoples, until it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, from the Arctic tundra to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. As we reflect on this second chapter of our story, we can see how the young Temujin had truly become the universal ruler that his title proclaimed. From the steppes of Mongol, he had reached out to touch the farthest corners of the known world. His armies had defeated the greatest powers of his time, his administrative innovations had created new forms of government, and his vision of empire had inspired a generation of conquerors who would carry on his work. The Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan had begun was not just a military achievement, but a cultural and economic revolution. The trade routes that connected East and West had been unified under a single authority for the first time in history. The technologies and ideas of different civilizations were beginning to cross-pollinate in ways that would transform the world. The stage was set for an age of unprecedented cultural exchange and economic growth. But the story of the Mongol Empire was far from over. The death of Genghis Khan was not the end but a new beginning, as his successors would carry the banner of conquest even further than he had dreamed. The greatest campaigns were still to come, the most spectacular victories still to be won, and the most lasting achievements still to be accomplished. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind wander across the vast territories that had been brought under Mongol control. Imagine the caravans of merchants traveling safely along the Silk Road, under the protection of the great Khan's law. Picture the skilled craftsmen and learned scholars who had been brought together from different cultures to share their knowledge and expertise. Feel the excitement of exploration and discovery that must have filled the hearts of those who were witnessing the birth of a new world order. The Mongol Empire was entering its golden age, a period of expansion and achievement that would reshape the map of Asia and Europe. The foundations laid by Genghis Khan were about to support a structure of unprecedented grandeur and complexity. The next generation of Mongol leaders would face new challenges and opportunities, would conquer new territories and peoples, and would leave their own mark on the pages of history. But all of that is a story for another night. For now, rest peacefully in the knowledge that the human capacity for achievement knows no bounds, and that even the most unlikely circumstances can give birth to the most extraordinary accomplishments. The boy who had once been abandoned on the steppes had become the master of much of the known world, and his legacy would endure for centuries to come. Sleep well, and dream of endless horizons and boundless possibilities.
The great Kurultai of 1229 gathered beneath the endless sky of the Mongolian steppes, where representatives from across the vast empire came to witness the formal coronation of Ögedei Khan as the great Khan of all the Mongols. 2 years had passed since the death of Genghis Khan, 2 years of careful preparation and political maneuvering to ensure a smooth transition of power. The empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Sea of Japan now had a new master, and with him came a new chapter in the extraordinary story of Mongol expansion. Ögedei was not the eldest of Genghis Khan's sons, nor was he the most feared warrior or the most brilliant general, but he possessed qualities that his father had recognized as essential for the next phase of Mongol development: diplomatic skill, administrative talent, and the ability to unite rather than divide. Where Genghis Khan had been the great conqueror, Ögedei would be the great organizer, the ruler who would transform a collection of conquered territories into a functioning empire. Let us drift back to that pivotal moment in 1229, when the new great Khan stood before the assembled nobles and generals, accepting the white banner of supreme authority. The ceremony was rich with ancient tradition, but it also marked the beginning of a new era. The age of pure conquest was giving way to an age of consolidation and expansion, of administrative innovation and cultural synthesis. The Mongol Empire was about to enter what many historians would later call its golden age. Ogedai's first great challenge was to complete the conquest of the Jin dynasty, which had been resisting Mongol rule for over 2 decades. The Jin had been reduced to a shadow of their former power, controlling only a small territory in northern China, but they remained defiant. Their capital had been moved to Kaifeng, and their armies, though greatly outnumbered, continued to resist with desperate courage. The final campaign against the Jin was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare. Ogedai did not simply overwhelm the remaining Jin forces with superior numbers, he systematically destroyed their capacity to resist. Mongol armies swept through the Chinese countryside, capturing cities and towns, destroying crops and infrastructure, and cutting off all hope of external aid. The Jin dynasty, which had once been one of the most powerful states in the world, was slowly strangled by the Mongol embrace. The siege of Kaifeng, which began in 1232, was one of the most sophisticated military operations in medieval history. The Mongols had learned much about siege warfare during their earlier campaigns, and they applied every lesson to the reduction of this final Jin stronghold. They surrounded the city with a wall of their own, preventing any supplies from reaching the defenders. They diverted rivers and built massive siege engines, bringing Chinese engineering expertise to bear against Chinese defenses. But perhaps most importantly, the Mongols had learned to use the Jin's own people against them. The Mongol Empire was remarkably inclusive for its time, welcoming skilled individuals regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. Chinese generals who had served the Jin were offered positions in the Mongol army. Chinese administrators who surrendered were allowed to continue their work under Mongol supervision. This policy not only strengthened the Mongol war machine, but also weakened Jin resistance by offering an alternative to death or slavery. The fall of Kaifeng in 1233 marked the effective end of the Jin dynasty, though a few remnants would hold out for another year. But more importantly, it marked the completion of Genghis Khan's vision of Chinese conquest. The Mongols now controlled all of northern China, with its vast population, rich agricultural lands, and sophisticated administrative systems. The empire had gained not just territory, but also the human resources and technical expertise that would make further expansion possible. With the Jin dynasty finally eliminated, Ogedai turned his attention to the great project that would define his reign. The reconnaissance mission of Jebi and Subutai had revealed the wealth and vulnerability of the western lands, and the time had come to exploit that knowledge. But this would not be a simple raid or limited campaign. Ogedai envisioned nothing less than the complete subjugation of Europe, from the forests of Russia to the Atlantic Ocean. The European campaign was planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized all great Mongol conquests. Multiple armies would advance simultaneously along different routes, preventing the Europeans from concentrating their forces against any single threat. The Mongols would use their superior mobility and communication systems to coordinate operations across vast distances, striking where they were least expected and retreating before effective resistance could be organized. The campaign began in 1237 with the invasion of the Russian principalities. The Mongol forces, led by Batu Khan, Ogedai's nephew, crossed the Volga River in winter and struck at the heart of Russian power. The cities of Ryazan, Moscow, and Vladimir fell in rapid succession, their walls and defenses proving no match for Mongol siegecraft. The Russian armies, brave but disorganized, were crushed in a series of battles that demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of Mongol military doctrine. The siege of Kiev in 1240 was the climax of the Russian campaign. Kiev was not just a city but a symbol Mongol, the mother of Russian cities, the seat of Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe, the cultural and spiritual center of the Russian world. Its massive walls and strategic location on the Dnieper River had made it seem impregnable to earlier invaders. But the Mongols brought new weapons and new tactics to the assault. The Mongol siege engines, based on Chinese designs but adapted for European conditions, battered the walls of Kiev with unprecedented fury. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that their city's fall would mean the end of Russian independence. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The Mongols had perfected the art of siege warfare to such a degree that no fortification could long resist their assault. When Kiev fell, the psychological impact was felt throughout Europe. The great city that had withstood Viking raids and steppe invasions for centuries had fallen to the Mongols in a matter of days. The destruction was total. The city's population was slaughtered or enslaved. Its buildings were razed, and its cultural treasures were carried away to enrich the Mongol Empire. A visitor who came to Kiev years later would write that he found only 600 houses in a city that had once been home to 50,000 people. But the conquest of Russia was only the beginning. The Mongol armies pressed westward into Poland and Hungary, two kingdoms that represented the last barriers between the steppes and the heart of Europe. The Polish campaign of 1241 was swift and devastating. The Mongols crossed the Vistula River and struck at the ancient city of Krakow, scattering the Polish armies and burning the city to the ground. The Battle of Legnica, in April 1241, was a masterpiece of Mongol tactical doctrine. The European knights, with their heavy armor and cavalry charges, seemed to represent everything that was powerful and advanced in Western military technology. But the Mongols turned the Europeans' own strength against them, using feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers to fragment the Western formations, and then destroying them piecemeal. The death of Duke Henry II of Silesia at Legnica sent shockwaves throughout Europe. This was not just another defeat, but a catastrophe that threatened the very existence of Christian civilization. The Mongols had proven that they could defeat the best that Europe had to offer, and there seemed to be no force that could stop their advance toward the Atlantic. Simultaneously with the Polish campaign, another Mongol army was advancing through Hungary under the command of Batu Khan himself. The Hungarian kingdom, with its vast plains and pastoral economy, seemed almost designed for Mongol conquest. King Bela IV of Hungary had received warnings about the Mongol advance and had attempted to prepare his defenses, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing the Mongol war machine. The Battle of Mongol, in April 1241, was perhaps the most decisive Mongol victory in Europe. The Hungarian army, estimated at over 100,000 men, was completely destroyed by a smaller Mongol force using superior tactics and coordination. The Mongols crossed the Saijo River at night, surrounded the Hungarian camp, and then systematically annihilated the European forces. King Bela barely escaped with his life, and the Kingdom of Hungary lay open to Mongol conquest. The aftermath of Mongol was as devastating as the battle itself. The Mongols swept across Hungary, capturing cities and towns with minimal resistance. The population fled before them, creating a refugee crisis that destabilized the entire region. The great city of Pest was burned to the ground, and the Mongols established winter quarters in the Hungarian plains, preparing for the next phase of their European campaign. By the end of 1241, the Mongol Empire had achieved something that no previous conqueror had accomplished: the complete subjugation of Eastern Europe. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Volga River, all was under Mongol control. The great cities of the region lay in ruins, their populations scattered or enslaved. The feudal armies that had once seemed so formidable had been swept away like leaves before a storm. The Mongols' success in Europe was not just a military achievement, but a demonstration of superior organization and planning. The Mongols had coordinated multiple campaigns across vast distances, maintained supply lines that stretched back to Mongol, and adapted their tactics to meet the specific challenges of European warfare. They had proven that the age of isolated kingdoms and regional powers was over, and that the future belonged to those who could think and act on a global scale. But just as the Mongols were preparing for the next phase of their European campaign, the conquest of the Holy Roman Empire, and perhaps even France's fate, intervened in the form of tragic news from the east. In December 1241, word reached the Mongol armies that Ögedei Khan had died suddenly at his capital of Karakorum. The great conqueror, who had planned the subjugation of Europe, had fallen victim to his own excesses, dying at the age of 56, after a reign of just 12 years. The death of Ögedei Khan changed everything. According to Mongol law and tradition, all the great commanders had to return to Mongolia to participate in the election of a new great Khan. Batu Khan, despite being on the verge of conquering all of Europe, had no choice but to withdraw his armies and return to the steppes. The European campaign was suspended, and the continent was given an unexpected reprieve from what had seemed like inevitable conquest. The withdrawal of the Mongol armies was as swift and efficient as their advance had been. Within months, the great war machine that had terrorized Europe had vanished back into the steppes, leaving behind only ruins and memories. The Europeans, who had been preparing for the end of their civilization, found themselves with a second chance, one that they would not waste. But while the Mongols were withdrawing from Europe, they were advancing on other fronts. The conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, which had been suspended during the European campaign, was resumed with renewed vigor. The Song represented a different kind of challenge from the Jin. They were wealthy, sophisticated and technologically advanced, with powerful navies and elaborate fortifications. But they were also divided and weakened by internal conflicts, making them vulnerable to Mongol pressure. The Mongol strategy against the Song was patient and methodical. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the heavily fortified Song cities, the Mongols focused on isolating them from their sources of supply and support. They conquered the peripheral territories first, gradually tightening their grip on the Song heartland. They also made extensive use of Chinese defectors and allies, turning the Song's own expertise against them. The siege of Xiangyang, which began in 1268 and lasted for 5 years, exemplified the Mongol approach to the Song conquest. The city was strategically located on the Han River and served as the key to the Song defensive system. The Mongols surrounded it with a vast network of fortifications, cutting off all supply routes and gradually starving the defenders into submission. When Xiangyang finally fell in 1273, the last major barrier to Mongol conquest of southern China was removed. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Mongol Empire was expanding its influence through a combination of conquest and diplomacy. The destruction of the Khepur's mid-empire had left a power vacuum in the region, and the Mongols were gradually filling it. The Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad, remained the nominal head of the Islamic world, but its actual power was limited, and its territories were vulnerable to Mongol pressure. The Mongol approach to the Middle East was complicated by the religious and cultural sensitivities of the region. Unlike China or Eastern Europe, where the Mongols could rely primarily on military conquest, the Middle East required a more nuanced approach. The Mongols had to balance their desire for expansion with the need to maintain stability in regions that were crucial to international trade and cultural exchange. The conquest of Baghdad in 1258 was one of the most controversial episodes in Mongol history. The city had been the capital of the Islamic world for over 5 centuries, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, and one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the world. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to philosophy and poetry. The Mongol siege of Baghdad was led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who had been entrusted with the conquest of the Middle East. The siege itself was relatively brief. The city's defenses were outdated, and its garrison was outnumbered, but the aftermath was catastrophic. The Mongols sacked the city with unprecedented thoroughness, destroying its libraries, massacring its population, and bringing to an end the golden age of Islamic civilization. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had survived for over 6 centuries, was suddenly extinct. The great libraries that had preserved Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Islamic theology were reduced to ashes. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture in Mesopotamia for thousands of years were destroyed, turning the fertile valleys into barren wastelands. But the Mongol advance in the Middle East was not unlimited. In 1260, a Mongol army was defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut, marking the first major Mongol defeat in the region. The Mamluks, who were skilled warriors and experienced in fighting steppe nomads, proved that the Mongols were not invincible. The defeat at Ain Jalut
marked the limit of Mongol expansion in the Middle East, and began the long process of Mongol withdrawal from the region. The reign of Ogedei Khan, though cut short by his untimely death, represented the high point of Mongol expansion and achievement. Under his leadership, the empire had reached its greatest extent, stretching from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The Mongol military machine had proven its effectiveness against every type of enemy: new nomadic tribes, settled kingdoms, fortified cities, and feudal armies. The Mongol administrative system had demonstrated its ability to govern vast territories and diverse populations. But perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire, under Ogedei, had begun to fulfill its potential as a force for cultural and economic integration. The Pax Mongol, peace, had created unprecedented opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. Merchants could travel safely from Europe to China, carrying goods and ideas across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire. Scholars and artists could move freely between different cultural centers, creating new forms of artistic expression and intellectual inquiry. The Mongol Empire had also become a great patron of learning and culture. The Mongols, despite their reputation for destruction, were remarkably tolerant of different religious and cultural traditions. They supported scholars and artists, encouraged trade and commerce, and created an environment where new ideas could flourish. The result was a period of unprecedented cultural synthesis, where Eastern and Western traditions combined to create new forms of art, literature, and philosophy. The death of Ogedei Khan in 1241 marked the beginning of a new phase in Mongol history. The empire that he had expanded and organized would continue to grow under his successors, but it would also begin to fragment as different regions developed their own distinct identities and interests. The great unity that Genghis Khan had created, and Ogedei had maintained, would gradually give way to a more complex and divided structure. But the achievements of the Ogedei era would not be forgotten. The Mongol Empire had proven that it was possible to create a truly global civilization, one that could unite diverse peoples and cultures under a common system of law and administration. The precedent had been set for future attempts at world empire, and the lessons learned would influence the development of international relations for centuries to come. As the Great Kurultai of 1246 gathered to elect a new Great Khan, the delegates were faced with a fundamental question about the future direction of the empire. Should they continue the aggressive expansion that had characterized the reigns of Genghis Khan and Ogedei, or should they focus on consolidating and organizing the vast territories they had already conquered? The answer would determine not only the fate of the Mongol Empire, but also the future of world civilization. The choice fell to Guguk Khan, Ogedei's eldest son, who was elected Great Khan after years of political maneuvering and debate. But Guguk's reign would be brief and troubled, marked by internal conflicts and external challenges that would test the unity of the empire. The great age of Mongol expansion was coming to an end, and the even greater challenge of governing a world empire was about to begin. The legacy of Ogedei Khan was complex and multifaceted. He had been a great conqueror, expanding the Mongol Empire to its greatest extent, and defeating some of the most powerful kingdoms of his time. He had been a skilled administrator, creating systems of government that could manage vast territories and diverse populations. He had been a patron of culture and learning, supporting scholars and artists, and encouraging the exchange of ideas across cultural boundaries. But perhaps most importantly, Ogedei had been a unifier, holding together the vast and disparate elements of the Mongol Empire through a combination of personal charisma, political skill, and administrative competence. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of an era, the end of the great age of Mongol unity and expansion. The Mongol Empire would continue to exist for many years after Ogedei's death, but it would never again achieve the unity and dynamism that had characterized its golden age. The empire would gradually fragment into separate khana, each with its own ruler and its own interests. The great vision of a unified world empire would give way to a more complex and divided reality. As we reflect on this third chapter of our journey through Mongol history, we can see how the empire had evolved from its humble beginnings, on the steppes of Mongolia. What had started as a collection of nomadic tribes had become the largest contiguous land empire in history, a force that had reshaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of Eurasia. The Mongol Empire, under Ögedei, had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of world empire. It had shown that it was possible to unite vast territories and diverse populations under a common system of rule, to create unprecedented opportunities for trade and cultural exchange, and to achieve military victories that seemed impossible. But it had also revealed the challenges of governing such a vast and complex entity, the difficulties of maintaining unity across such diverse regions, and the inevitable tensions between expansion and consolidation. The story of the Mongol Empire was far from over. The death of Ögedei Khan marked not the end but a transition to a new phase, one that would be characterized by both fragmentation and achievement, by both decline and cultural flowering. The empire would continue to shape the course of world history for centuries to come, but it would do so in ways that its founders could never have imagined. As you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind drift across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire at its height. Imagine the caravans of merchants traveling the Silk Road under the protection of Mongol law, the scholars and artists moving freely between different cultural centers, the administrators and generals working to maintain order across a territory that stretched from sunrise to sunset. Picture the great cities of the empire, Karakoram, the capital where representatives from across the known world gathered to pay homage to the great Khan. Beijing, the ancient Chinese capital now serving as the center of Mongol administration in the east. Kiev, rebuilding itself after the devastation of conquest. Baghdad, struggling to recover from the destruction that had ended the golden age of Islamic civilization. Feel the excitement and the terror, the opportunity and the challenge, the hope and the despair that characterized this remarkable period in human history. The Mongol Empire had created a new world, one where the boundaries between East and West, between nomad and settled, between conqueror and conquered, were being redrawn in ways that would influence the course of human development for centuries to come. But all of this achievement had come at a tremendous cost. Millions had died in the wars of conquest, great cities had been destroyed, and entire civilizations had been transformed beyond recognition. The Mongol Empire represented both the greatest triumph and the greatest tragedy of medieval history, a testament to both the potential and the destructive power of human ambition. Sleep peacefully, knowing that even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit has found ways to create beauty, to preserve knowledge, and to build bridges between different peoples and cultures. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence and destruction, had also been a force for unity and exchange, bringing together the peoples of Eurasia in ways that would enrich all of their civilizations.
In the vast halls of Karakoram, where the winds of the steppes whispered through corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of the world's most powerful rulers, a new chapter was beginning in the extraordinary story of the Mongol Empire. The death of Ögedei Khan in 1241 had marked the end of an era of unprecedented unity and expansion, but it had also opened the door to a period of remarkable transformation and cultural flowering that would reshape the civilizations of Asia and Europe for centuries to come. The Great Kurultai of 1246 had elected Genghis Khan as the new Great Khan, but his reign would be brief and troubled, lasting only 2 years before his own death in 1248. The empire that had once moved with the unity of a single will now found itself pulled in different directions by competing interests, regional loyalties, and the simple challenges of governing territories so vast that it took months for messages to travel from one end to the other. Yet what might have appeared as decline to some was actually the beginning of a new phase of Mongol civilization. The empire was not collapsing but evolving, adapting to the realities of governing settled populations across diverse cultural regions. The great unified empire of Genghis Khan and Ögedei was giving way to a constellation of related but increasingly independent khanates, each developing its own character while maintaining the common heritage of the Mongol tradition. Let us drift gently into this fascinating period of transformation, when the Mongol Empire, like a great river reaching a vast delta, divided into multiple channels while continuing to nourish the civilizations it touched. The story of the Mongol Empire's later period is not one of simple decline but of adaptation, cultural synthesis, and the remarkable ability of a nomadic tradition to transform itself while transforming the world. The election of Genghis Khan in 1251 marked the beginning of the empire's final great phase of expansion. Mongke, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his son Tolui, brought new energy and organization to the imperial administration. He understood that the empire had grown beyond the capacity of any single ruler to manage directly, and he began the process of systematic delegation that would eventually lead to the creation of the Great Khanates. Under Mongke's guidance, the empire launched its final great conquests. In the east, his brother Kublai Khan was entrusted with the completion of the Song dynasty's conquest in southern China. In the west, another brother, Hulagu Khan, was given the task of conquering the Middle East and establishing Mongol rule over the Islamic world. These were not merely military campaigns but carefully planned projects of imperial expansion and cultural integration. The conquest of the Song dynasty, which had begun under Ögedei, now entered its final phase. The Song had proven to be the most challenging opponents the Mongols had ever faced, not because of their military prowess, but because of their technological sophistication and economic resilience. The Song possessed advanced naval capabilities, sophisticated siege engines, and perhaps most importantly, the financial resources to sustain long campaigns of resistance. The Mongol strategy against the Song was patient and methodical. Rather than attempting to overwhelm the Song armies in direct battle, the Mongols focused on isolating Song strongholds and gradually strangling their supply lines. They made extensive use of Chinese defectors and allies, turning the Song's own expertise against them. They also adapted their traditional cavalry tactics to the riverine environment of southern China, developing new techniques for amphibious warfare and siegecraft. The siege of Xiangyang, which lasted from 1268 to 1273, became the symbol of this final phase of the Song conquest. The city commanded the Han River and served as the key to the Song defensive system. The Mongols surrounded it with a vast network of fortifications, employing Muslim engineers to build massive trebuchets and other siege engines. The siege became a test of wills between two great civilizations, with the Mongols demonstrating their ability to adapt their nomadic warfare to the challenges of settled siegecraft. When Xiangyang finally fell, the last major barrier to Mongol conquest of southern China was removed. The Song court, which had retreated to the coastal city of Quanzhou, could only watch as their empire crumbled around them. The final Song emperor, a child, died in 1279 when the last Song fleet was destroyed in a naval battle off the coast of Guangdong. With his death, the Song dynasty, which had ruled China for over 3 centuries, came to an end. The establishment of the Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai Khan, marked one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of the Mongol Empire. Kublai, who had been named Great Khan in 1260, chose to rule his Chinese territories not as a nomadic conqueror, but as a Chinese emperor. He established his capital at Dadu, the city that would later become Beijing, and adopted many of the traditions and ceremonies of Chinese imperial rule. The Yuan dynasty represented a unique synthesis of Mongol and Chinese traditions. Kublai Khan maintained the Mongol military system and administrative structure, but he also embraced Chinese culture and learning. He patronized Chinese scholars and artists, supported the development of Chinese literature and philosophy, and created an environment where Chinese civilization could flourish under Mongol rule. The economic prosperity of Yuan China was remarkable. The Mongol Empire's vast trade networks brought unprecedented wealth to Chinese cities. The Silk Road, now secured by Mongol military power, carried goods and ideas across the entire breadth of Eurasia. Chinese porcelain, silk and tea reached European markets, while European and Middle Eastern goods found their way to Chinese consumers. The result was a period of economic growth and cultural exchange that enriched all the participating civilizations. The court of Kublai Khan became one of the most cosmopolitan centers in the medieval world. Chinese scholars worked alongside Persian administrators, European merchants traded with Arab mathematicians, and Mongol nobles learned to appreciate Chinese poetry and painting. The The emperor himself was a patron of learning and culture, supporting scholars and artists from across the known world. It was during this period that Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, spent 17 years in China, serving in various capacities in the UN administration. His eventual return to Europe and his account of his travels would introduce Europeans to the wonders of Chinese civilization and the extent of Mongol power. Through his eyes we can see the remarkable achievement of the Yuan dynasty and Mongol Empire that had successfully adapted to Chinese conditions while maintaining its own distinct identity. The Yuan dynasty also presided over remarkable technological and cultural achievements. Chinese inventors, working under Mongol patronage, developed new techniques in metallurgy, printing and navigation. Chinese artists created new forms of painting and sculpture that reflected the cultural synthesis of the Mongol period. Chinese scholars produced works of literature and philosophy that would influence Chinese thought for centuries to come. Meanwhile, in the western regions of the empire, Hulagu Khan was establishing the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East. The conquest of Baghdad in 1258 had marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, but it was only the beginning of the Mongol transformation of the Islamic world. The Ilkhanate, which would rule Persia and surrounding regions for over a century, represented another unique synthesis of Mongol and local traditions. The Mongol rulers of the Ilkhanate faced challenges that were different from those encountered in China. The Islamic world had its own rich traditions of administration, law and culture, and the Mongols had to find ways to work within these existing frameworks. The process was not always smooth. The destruction of Baghdad had created deep resentment among the Muslim population, and the Mongols had to work carefully to win the loyalty of their new subjects. The Ilkhanate's approach to governance was pragmatic and flexible. While maintaining ultimate authority, the Mongol rulers allowed local administrators to continue their work, Islamic law to operate alongside Mongol law, and Islamic culture to flourish under Mongol protection. The result was a period of cultural renaissance that saw the development of new forms of Islamic art, literature and scholarship. The conversion of the Ilkhanate rulers to Islam, beginning with Ghazan Khan in 1295, marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between the Mongols and their Persian subjects. By embracing Islam, the Mongol rulers demonstrated their commitment to their new homeland, and their willingness to adopt local customs and traditions. This conversion helped to legitimize Mongol rule, and created opportunities for deeper cultural integration. Under Islamic Mongol rule, Persia experienced a remarkable cultural flowering. Persian poets and scholars produced works that would become classics of world literature. Persian artists developed new techniques in miniature painting and calligraphy. Persian administrators created new systems of governance that combined Mongol efficiency with Islamic principles. The result was a unique cultural synthesis that enriched both Mongol and Persian traditions. The Ilkhanate also became a major center of international trade and cultural exchange. Persian merchants, protected by Mongol military power, established trading networks that stretched from China to Europe. Persian scholars translated works from Arabic, Chinese and other languages, creating a remarkable synthesis of world knowledge. The court of the Ilkhanate became a meeting place for scholars, artists and merchants from across the known world. In the western regions of the empire, the Golden Horde was establishing its own unique form of Mongol civilization. The Golden Horde, which ruled the Russian principalities and the western steppes, represented yet another adaptation of Mongol traditions to local conditions. Unlike the Yuan dynasty or the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde maintained a more traditional nomadic lifestyle while exercising suzerainty over settled populations. The relationship between the Golden Horde and the Russian principalities was complex and evolving. The Mongols did not attempt to rule Russia directly, but instead established a system of tributary relationships with the Russian princes. The princes were required to pay tribute to the Mongol Khan and to provide military service when required, but they were allowed to maintain their own administrative systems and cultural traditions. This system of indirect rule had profound implications for the development of Russian civilization. The Russian principalities, while maintaining their independence in local affairs, were integrated into the broader Mongol world system. Russian merchants gained access to the vast trade networks of the Mongol Empire. Russian scholars were exposed to new ideas and technologies, and Russian culture was enriched by contact with the diverse peoples of the Mongol world. The Golden Horde's capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga River, became one of the great cities of the medieval world. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sarai was a cosmopolitan center where Mongols, Russians, Bulgars and other peoples lived and worked together. The city was a major center of trade and culture, with markets where goods from across Eurasia were bought and sold, and schools where scholars from different traditions taught and learned from each other. The Golden Horde also played a crucial role in the development of Russian political institutions. The Mongol system of administration, with its emphasis on efficiency and centralization, influenced the development of Russian governmental structures. The Russian princes, in their efforts to maintain their positions within the Mongol system, developed new forms of political organization that would eventually contribute to the emergence of the unified Russian state. The cultural impact of the Golden Horde on Russian civilization was equally significant. Russian art and architecture were influenced by Mongol styles and techniques. Russian literature incorporated themes and motifs from Mongol culture. Russian military organization adopted Mongol tactics and strategies. The result was a unique synthesis that enriched Russian culture while maintaining its distinctive character. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the Mongol Empire was transforming itself in ways that its founders could never have imagined. What had begun as a unified empire, under the leadership of a single great Khan, was becoming a constellation of related but increasingly independent Khanate, each developing its own character, while maintaining connections to the broader Mongol world. This process of fragmentation was not a sign of weakness, but of strength and adaptability. The Mongol Empire had grown so large and diverse that no single ruler could effectively govern it from a central location. The division into separate Khanate allowed for more effective local governance while maintaining the benefits of membership in the broader Mongol world system. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Il Khanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, each developed their own approaches to governance, their own cultural synthesis, and their own relationships with their subjects. Yet they all maintained the common heritage of Mongol tradition and the shared benefits of the Mongol world system. The Pax Mongolk, the great peace that had been established by Mongol military power, continued to facilitate trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. The Silk Road reached its highest level of activity during this period, with caravans carrying goods and ideas across the entire breadth of the continent. The Mongol Empire had created the world's first truly global economy, connecting the civilizations of East and West in ways that had never before been possible. The cultural achievements of this period were remarkable. Chinese porcelain reached European tables, Persian poetry was read in Chinese courts, and European merchants learned to navigate by Chinese compasses. The Mongol Empire had created an environment where different cultures could interact and influence each other, leading to new forms of art, literature, and scholarship that enriched all the participating civilizations. The technological innovations of this period were equally impressive. The Mongols, who had begun as nomadic warriors, became patrons of learning and innovation. Under their rule, Chinese inventors developed new techniques in printing and navigation, Persian scholars made advances in mathematics and astronomy, and European merchants learned new methods of commerce and finance. The result was a period of technological progress that laid the foundation for many later developments. But even as the Mongol Empire was reaching new heights of cultural and economic achievement, the forces of change were beginning to work against it. The conversion of the Ilkhanate rulers to Islam, while helping to legitimize their rule, also began to weaken their connections to the broader Mongol world. The adoption of Chinese customs by the Yuan dynasty, while facilitating their rule in China, also began to distance them from their nomadic origins. The Golden Horde, which had maintained more traditional nomadic practices, began to face pressure from the growing power of the Russian principalities. The Chagatai Khanate, caught between the expanding power of the other Khanate and the growing strength of local rulers, began to fragment into smaller units. The great unity that had characterized the early Mongol Empire was gradually giving way to a more complex and divided structure. The process of fragmentation was accelerated by the practical challenges of governing such a vast and diverse empire. Communication across the empire took months,
making coordinated action difficult. The different Khanate began to develop their own interests and priorities, which did not always align with those of the empire as a whole. The common Mongol identity that had united the empire began to weaken as the different Khanates adopted local customs and traditions. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse but a gradual transformation. The Yuan dynasty in China, which had seemed so strong and stable, began to face internal rebellions and external pressures. The Chinese population, which had initially accepted Mongol rule, began to chafe under foreign domination. The Mongol military system, which had been so effective against external enemies, proved less effective against internal rebellion. The Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s, marked the beginning of the end for the Yuan dynasty. The rebellion was led by Chinese peasants and supported by Chinese scholars and officials who resented Mongol rule. The rebellion spread rapidly across China, taking advantage of the Yuan dynasty's military weaknesses and administrative failures. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty had been overthrown and replaced by the Wanning dynasty, marking the end of Mongol rule in China. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced similar challenges. The conversion to Islam, while helping to legitimize Mongol rule, also created new sources of tension. The Mongol rulers found themselves caught between their traditional nomadic followers and their new Islamic subjects. The Ilkhanate began to fragment into smaller units, each controlled by different branches of the Mongol royal family, or local strongmen. The Golden Horde, which had seemed the most stable of the Mongol Khanate, also began to face serious challenges. The Russian principalities, which had grown stronger and more unified under Mongol rule, began to assert their independence. The Battle of Kulikovo, in 1380, where a coalition of Russian princes defeated a Mongol army, marked the beginning of the end for Mongol dominance in Russia. The Chagatai Khanate, which had been the weakest of the major Khanates, was the first to completely fragment. By the end of the 14th century, it had been divided into numerous small principalities, each ruled by local strongmen who claimed Mongol ancestry but had little real connection to the broader Mongol world. The great empire that had once stretched from Korea to Poland was dissolving into its component parts. The Mongol world system, which had facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia, was being replaced by a more fragmented and localized structure. The age of Mongol dominance was coming to an end. Yet even as the political structure of the Mongol Empire was dissolving, its cultural and economic legacy continued to influence the development of Eurasian civilization. The trade networks that had been established under Mongol rule continued to operate, though under different management. The cultural syntheses that had been created during the Mongol period continued to influence art, literature, and scholarship. The technological innovations that had been developed under Mongol patronage continued to spread and develop. The Mongol Empire had created the world's first truly global civilization, connecting the peoples of East and West in ways that had never before been possible. Even as the empire itself was dissolving, the precedent had been established for future attempts at global integration. The Mongol Empire had shown that it was possible to create a unified world system, even if maintaining that unity proved to be beyond the capacity of any single ruler or dynasty. The legacy of the Mongol Empire was complex and multifaceted. It had been a force for both destruction and creation, bringing both devastation and prosperity to the peoples it conquered. It had destroyed old civilizations and created new ones, ended some traditions and began others, caused suffering and created opportunities. The final judgment on the Mongol Empire would depend on one's perspective and priorities. In China, the legacy of the Yuan dynasty was mixed. The Mongols had brought political unity to China and had facilitated economic growth and cultural exchange, but they had also imposed foreign rule on the Chinese people and had disrupted traditional Chinese institutions. The Ming dynasty, which replaced the Yuan, would build on Mongol achievements while rejecting Mongol political control. In Persia, the legacy of the Ilkhanate was equally complex. The Mongols had brought political stability to a region that had been torn by conflict, and had facilitated a remarkable cultural flowering, but they had also destroyed the old Islamic order, and had imposed foreign rule on the Persian people. The successor states to the Ilkhanate would struggle to maintain the achievements of the Mongol period, while establishing their own legitimacy. In Russia, the legacy of the Golden Horde was perhaps the most enduring. The Mongol period had contributed to the development of Russian political institutions, and had facilitated the eventual unification of the Russian principalities. The Russian state that emerged from the Mongol period would be stronger and more centralized than its predecessors, though it would also be more authoritarian and militaristic. The final chapter of the Mongol Empire was written not in the great cities of China or Persia, but in the steppes of Central Asia, where the descendants of Genghis Khan continued to rule small principalities, and to dream of restoring the great empire of their ancestors. The most famous of these descendants was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who in the late 14th century attempted to recreate the Mongol Empire under his own rule. Timur's empire, which stretched from India to the Mediterranean, was in many ways a recreation of the Mongol Empire. Like his Mongol predecessors, Timur was a brilliant military commander who used superior tactics and organization to defeat much larger enemies. Like them, he was a patron of learning and culture, who supported scholars and artists from across the known world. Like them, he created a vast empire that facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. But Timur's empire, like the Mongol Empire before it, proved to be too vast and diverse to be governed effectively by a single ruler. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire quickly fragmented into competing principalities, each ruled by his descendants or by local strongmen. The dream of a unified Eurasian empire, which had motivated both Genghis Khan and Timur, remained unfulfilled. The last great Mongol conqueror was Babur, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur, who in the early 16th century established the Mongol Empire in India. The Mongol Empire, which would rule much of the Indian subcontinent for over 3 centuries, represented the final flowering of the Mongol tradition of conquest and empire building. The Mongol Empire was in many ways a synthesis of Mongol, Persian, and Indian traditions. The Mongol rulers maintained the Mongol military system and administrative structure, but they also embraced Persian culture and Indian traditions. They created a unique form of Islamic civilization that incorporated elements from all the cultures they encountered. The cultural achievements of the Mongol Empire were remarkable. Mongol architects created some of the most beautiful buildings in the world, including the Taj Mahal. Mongol artists developed new forms of painting and sculpture that combined Persian, Indian, and European influences. Mongol scholars produced works of literature and philosophy that would influence Indian thought for centuries to come. But even the Mongol Empire, for all its achievements, could not recreate the global reach and influence of the original Mongol Empire. The world had changed since the time of Genghis Khan and Ogedei. New powers had emerged, new technologies had been developed, and new forms of political organization had been created. The age of nomadic conquest was coming to an end, and the future belonged to settled states with professional armies and bureaucratic administrations. The Mongol Empire had been the last great nomadic empire, the final expression of a way of life that had dominated the steppes of Central Asia for thousands of years. Its rise and fall marked the end of an era in world history, the transition from the age of nomadic conquest to the age of settled civilization. The Mongols had conquered the world, but in doing so, they had also been conquered by it, transformed from nomadic warriors into settled rulers, from destroyers of civilizations into creators of new ones. As we reach the end of our journey through the story of the Mongol Empire, we can see how it had transformed not only the world, but also itself. What had begun as a collection of nomadic tribes united by a charismatic leader had become a global civilization that influenced the development of art, science, technology, and culture across the entire breadth of Eurasia. The Mongol Empire had created the world's first truly global economy, connecting the civilizations of East and West in ways that had never before been possible. It had facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances, creating opportunities for cultural synthesis and innovation that enriched all the participating civilizations. The Mongol Empire had also created new forms of political organization that would influence the development of government and administration for centuries to come. The Mongol system of law, with its emphasis on religious tolerance and cultural diversity, provided a model for future attempts at multicultural governance. The Mongol administrative system, with its emphasis on efficiency and merit-based promotion, influenced the development of bureaucratic institutions across Eurasia. The technological innovations that were developed under Mongol rule had profound implications for the future development of human civilization. The printing press, which was perfected in Yuan China, would revolutionize the spread of knowledge and information. The compass and other navigational instruments, which were developed under Mongol patronage, would make possible the great age of exploration that would follow. The financial innovations that were created to manage the vast Mongol trade networks would lay the foundation for the development of modern banking and commerce. The cultural achievements of the Mongol period were equally significant. The Mongol Empire had created an environment where different cultures could interact and influence each other, leading to new forms of art, literature, and scholarship. The great works of literature that were produced during the Mongol period, from Chinese poetry to Persian miniatures to Russian chronicles, would influence the development of their respective traditions for centuries to come. The Mongol Empire had also created new forms of religious and philosophical synthesis. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance had allowed different traditions to coexist and influence each other, leading to new forms of spiritual expression and philosophical inquiry. The great religious and philosophical works that were produced during the Mongol period would continue to influence human thought long after the empire itself had disappeared. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mongol Empire was the precedent it established for global integration and cooperation. The Mongol Empire had shown that it was possible to create a unified world system that could benefit all its participants, regardless of their cultural or ethnic background. It had demonstrated that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that different traditions could coexist and enrich each other. The Mongol Empire had also shown the importance of leadership in creating and maintaining such a system. The success of the empire had depended on the vision and skill of its leaders, from Genghis Khan to Kublai Khan, from Hulagu to Batu. These leaders had been able to unite diverse peoples and cultures under a common system of rule, creating opportunities for prosperity and cultural exchange that would not have been possible otherwise. The failure of the Mongol Empire to maintain its unity and coherence had also provided important lessons for future attempts at global integration. The empire had shown that even the most successful system of global governance would face challenges from regional interests, cultural differences, and the practical difficulties of governing vast and diverse territories. The solutions to these challenges would require new forms of political organization and new approaches to international cooperation.
As you prepare to drift into sleep, let your mind wander across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire at its height, when a single system of law and administration stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Western Europe, when merchants and scholars could travel safely across the entire breadth of Eurasia, when the exchange of goods and ideas created unprecedented opportunities for cultural synthesis and innovation. Picture the great cities of the Mongol world Karakoram, where the great Khan held court and representatives from across the known world came to pay their respects. Dadu, where Kublai Khan ruled over the Middle Kingdom with a mixture of Mongol efficiency and Chinese wisdom. Tabriz, where the Ilkhanate created a unique synthesis of Mongol, Persian, and Islamic traditions. Sarai, where the Golden Horde maintained its connection to the nomadic traditions of the steppes while governing the settled populations of Russia. Feel the excitement of the caravans setting out across the Silk Road, carrying silk and spices, porcelain and precious metals, books and works of art, ideas and innovations from one end of the world to the other. Imagine the scholars and artists moving freely between different cultural centers, learning from each other and creating new forms of expression that would enrich all the traditions they encountered. See the great libraries of the Mongol world, where works in Chinese and Persian, Arabic and Latin, Mongolian and Russian were preserved and studied side by side. Think of the astronomers and mathematicians working together to understand the movements of the heavens, the physicians and scholars collaborating to heal the sick and advance human knowledge, the poets and artists creating works of beauty that would inspire future generations. But also remember the cost of this great achievement: the cities that were destroyed, the populations that were displaced, the civilizations that were transformed beyond recognition. The Mongol Empire was both a great achievement and a great tragedy, a testament to both the creative and destructive power of human ambition. The story of the Mongol Empire is ultimately the story of human potential, the potential to create and to destroy, to unite and to divide, to build bridges between different peoples and cultures, or to tear them down. The Mongols had shown that it was possible to create a unified world system, but they had also shown how difficult it was to maintain such a system over time. As the centuries passed and the Mongol Empire faded into history, its legacy would continue to influence the development of human civilization. The precedent it had established for global integration would inspire future attempts at world unity. The cultural synthesis it had created would continue to enrich the traditions they had brought together. The technological innovations it had fostered would continue to drive human progress. The Mongol Empire had created the world's first truly global civilization, and in doing so, it had changed the course of human history forever. The world that emerged from the Mongol period would be more connected, more diverse, and more complex than the world that had existed before. The age of isolated civilizations was over, and the age of global interaction had begun. Sleep peacefully, knowing that even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit has found ways to create beauty, to preserve knowledge, and to build bridges between different peoples and cultures. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence and destruction, had also been a force for unity and exchange, bringing together the peoples of Eurasia in ways that would enrich all of their civilizations. The great empire of the steppes had risen and fallen, but its legacy would endure in the art and literature, the science and technology, the customs and traditions that it had helped to create and spread. The Mongol Empire had shown that the world was one, and that knowledge belonged to all humanity.